Now, B-segment SUVs are all the rage, with vehicles like Honda's HR-V and Toyota's Corolla Cross winning plenty of fans across the country. But today, we're here to take a look at the number 1 and number 2 best-selling B-segment SUVs. The Chery Omoda 5, the challenger in the segment, versus the long-standing 2024 PROTON X50, recently updated in order to keep buyers interested. Let's take a look at what is arguably the most asked question on our channel. Which one's better, PROTON or Chery? Now, before we get into anything more interesting, we have to first touch on the basics. So we'll start with the price. This is the Chery Omoda 5 High, which comes in at about 118,000 ringgit with a 7-year warranty and an additional 10-year, 1 million kilometer warranty on the powertrain if you pay a little bit extra. The X50, on the other hand, has recently been refreshed, and with it come a small number of updates which apparently make this car a lot more livable, and this now comes in at 113,000 ringgit. Now, what's also broadly similar are the powertrains, but I have to say that these two cars do trade blows. On the left, we have the Omoda 5 with a 1.5-litre 4-cylinder turbocharged engine, which is mated to a CVT automatic gearbox. Now, in terms of power outputs, this engine isn't really all that bad because it produces about 156 horsepower and 230 Newton meters of torque, which is why you get the 230T badge on the back. Now, this, being the X50 flagship, gets the 1.5-litre direct gasoline injection 3-cylinder powertrain, which produces 177 PS and 255 Newton meters of torque, with power going to the front wheels via a 7-speed dual-clutch automatic gearbox. So while the X50 is clearly the more powerful of the two, with a new refined gearbox which has a slightly higher final drive ratio in order to improve not only NVH but also fuel consumption when cruising at speed, the Omoda 5 does take the lick in terms of fuel economy, with our testing revealing this car to do about 8 litres to the 100, whereas this will do closer to 9 litres to the 100. Now, as I've said, in terms of powertrain, these cars are broadly very similar. In terms of price, they are also broadly very similar, which is part of the reason why the PROTON X50 remains the number 1 best-selling B-segment SUV, but the Omoda 5 nips at its heels at number 2. Now, for 2024, PROTON has updated the X50 with what they call a running change, which means that all of the updates are to things that you cannot see, so exterior-wise, it looks very familiar. Now, this isn't exactly a very big deal because the X50 was already a very handsome-looking car to begin with. You have that very aggressive front end, the full LED headlights and LED fog lights. You get the dual-tone alloy wheels. You get this lovely dual-tone paint finish for the flagship model, and you have these very typically SUV proportions, which I think do make this car look quite fetching. Whereas if you look at the Omoda 5, this is a much more expressive, much bolder vehicle. You can tell by the use of red accents as well as that dual-tone paint finish. You also have this much more expressive front end with this enormous grille, which I think is a little bit Marmite. I don't really know whether I like it or not, but it's certainly not as offensive as it was the first time I saw it. Now, clearly, if you want the bolder looking of the two, you will prefer the Omoda 5, whereas if you prefer a slightly more traditional take on aggression, you might prefer the X50. One thing I'd like to point out is rolling stock. So both the Omoda 5 and the X50 run on 18-inch alloy wheels, but there is obviously a difference in terms of tires. Now, the Omoda 5 runs on GT Comfort F50 tires, whereas the PROTON X50 runs on Continental Ultra Contact 6. Now, obviously, between the two, the Ultra Contact 6 from Continental is a higher performance tire, which means that it is a lot better when it's dry and also significantly better when it's wet. That said, however, these GT Comfort tires available on the Omoda 5 have a slightly lower rolling resistance, which contributes to its better fuel economy, although it does come at the compromise of a little bit more road noise and slightly less stellar wet weather performance. Now, a key area for B-segment crossovers is practicality. Now, as part of the 2024 update, the PROTON X50 now gets a standard power tailgate for the flagship model, whereas the Omoda 5 always came with one. Now, I will argue that the capacities are a little bit different, but the X50 does appear to be a little bit more practical given the fact the load area is a little bit taller than what you get on the Omoda 5. The Omoda 5's boot is a little bit higher due to the fact that this car is available in other markets as a hybrid, and so there needs to be some space underneath the boot floor for all of that gubbins. But since we don't get that, we instead get a space saver spare wheel. Both of them get that actually. And in terms of the overall capacity and other amenities within them, the PROTON X50 does have these little cubbies down here on the side, which means that if you have, for example, a set of golf clubs, you should be able to fit them widthways across the front of the car, whereas here you might have to put them a little bit more diagonally. Now, it is also worth noting that while both of these cars can open their tailgates via the key, the Omoda 5 comes with what's known as a proximity sensing key, which means that if you stand by the back long enough, the boot will open automatically. The X50 does not offer that. PROTON only offers that on the X90. That said, however, I've disabled it in the Omoda simply because if I have to squeeze past the car, if I've reverse parked against a wall, for example, I don't want this to open and smack me in the face, or worse still, open up into a wall. Now, life in the Chery at first glance certainly looks to be quite impressive because for starters you have these twin 12.3-inch screens up ahead of you controlling the majority of your functions. You have a set of touch-sensitive HVAC controls up here. You get a fast wireless charger as well, nicely lined in suede or something like suede, as well as some space under here. You have these lovely leatherette seats with integrated headrests which look a little bit sportier, and you have lots of really nice textures about the place which makes the Omoda 5 feel like a very upmarket place to be. Now, in terms of the overall quality in here, I think things are generally quite alright. They're certainly on par for the segment. You don't get any particularly nice materials about the place, and it's no upgrade over various other vehicles, but I think that where they have used soft touch materials is quite generous. So this is all soft touch, so where you rest your arms is nice and soft. This is nice and soft touch, and this center console, for example, feels very, very solid indeed, zero flex whatsoever. Like a lot of modern cars, you also get an electronic gear selector, which means you have space underneath the center console. Now, one of the things about this car that I don't quite like is the fact that the USB ports, one USB-C, one USB-A, are on this little panel which is angled towards the passenger seat. So it's very easy for me to access this, but as the driver, not so much. On top of that, while this car offers wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, if you prefer that to be wired, you'll need that USB-A port out on this side, which means you'll end up with a cable that sort of runs rather ungainly sort of over the center console. Now, speaking of interior sort of bits and pieces, so you have a decently sized glove box, that's good. You've got decently sized door bins, that's good. You get decently sized cup holders here, which is also good, and you even get an air-conditioned center console. The only trouble I have with this is if you're to have a cup like this, it actually impedes your ability in order to change the gear. So while this was here earlier while I was driving, I had to sort of do that to change the gears. Not so great. I would have preferred this to be here because these wireless charging pads could have been here instead. On top of that, there is nowhere for me to put my sunglasses, which means I've had to resort to keeping the case here on the wireless charger, which I don't use because all it does is heat up my phone. Now, aside from that, in terms of overall space, the Omoda 5 is relatively generous. So you have a relatively flat floor in the back, which means that space in the rear for passengers is also pretty good. Although if you'd like to learn more about the Omoda 5, you can check out our full review up here. But like I said, overall life in here is pretty good, and I appreciate the fact that in addition to Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, this car also comes with two ventilated seats up front, which are also both powered, and on this model you also get an 8-speaker Sony audio system, which is, again, not bad. Now, in the X50, I'm going to address a few things straight off the bat. Number one, we do not get Apple CarPlay or Android Auto wired or wireless. Number two, we do not get ventilated seats up front. And number three, there is only a powered driver's seat. This seat is still manual. But that aside, stepping into the X50 from the Omoda 5 reveals that there is, surprisingly, a little bit more quality in this cabin. For starters, the use of soft touch material is a lot more generous in this car. Not only are the front tops, or rather the tops of the front door cards soft touch, but so is the stitched panel up here on the top of the dash. On top of that, the use of this brushed aluminium sort of look on the dash front also makes this car look a little bit more upmarket. The same goes in terms of the infotainment, because this IHU, although this uses an Acotech system, which is something that's developed locally, it looks and feels and operates in a manner that is a lot more appealing to Malaysian customers and certainly looks and feels a lot more polished than what we get in the Omoda 5. On top of that, this isn't just in terms of looks, because the IHU in the X50 also comes with its own 4G connectivity. So during the ownership period of this vehicle, for the first 5 years, this car comes with free 1 GB of data every month, which also means that you can access and utilize and manipulate this car via the PROTON app, which allows you to lock and unlock the vehicle, remote start it, check the windows, check the fuel level, etc. All of this are things that you do not get in the Chery, so it is a little bit of a mixed bag in terms of the technical and technological specification. On top of that, while the Omoda 5's HVAC controls are largely in the screen, including things like manipulating the fan speed or the ventilated seats, in the X50 there is at least a row of physical buttons which not only are very easy to use, but they also feel very nice to manipulate as well. It is worth noting that this particular bank of buttons is actually shared with the Lotus Emira. Now, in terms of the actual technological bits and in terms of the buttons and switchgear, I do feel that the PROTON X50 is built to a slightly better standard than the Omoda 5. There is something about this interior that feels a lot more solid and a lot better put together. And having visited the PROTON plant in Tanjung Malim to actually see how these cars are put together, and more importantly, how quality control checks are conducted every single day at that production line, I can attest that this X50 should be built very well indeed. Now, in terms of practicality, there is a little bit of less space underneath the center console versus the Omoda 5, but at least the USB ports are a lot easier to access, as well as the 12-volt socket. This cubby here is a little bit smaller, and the central cubby here does not come with air conditioning vents, but at least the cup holders are placed away from the gear selector, and so there is no sort of ergonomic issue there. On top of that, all of the buttons here for your drive modes, your 360-degree camera, your hill descent control, as well as your automatic park assist are all placed in an area that is closest to the driver, which again is a little bit more ergonomic compared to what we've seen from the Chinese car. Now, that said, it doesn't all sort of work out all that well. So while the X50 has a sunglasses holder, which I like, as well as a panoramic sunroof in this flagship model, space in the rear is not quite as commodious as the Omoda 5. There's something about the packaging in here that means that you get a little bit less legroom compared to the Chery. But that said, it is plenty big enough, and it certainly does, or rather the X50 performs very well amongst other segment competitors, and so this against the Omoda 5 is still sort of a mixed bag. That said, the interior design of this car is certainly a lot sportier compared to the Omoda 5, even though that car has those integrated headrests, because the seats in this are a lot more corseting and they hold you better in place, but again, you give up ventilation. That sense of quality actually extends to the way the X50 drives. Now, I suspect that this is down to the fact that the engineers both at Geely and PROTON are slightly more experienced when it comes to making cars, particularly for export markets, which is why the X50 drives as tidily as it does. Getting into this car, from the moment you set off, you can immediately feel that this is again a car that's built to a slightly better quality than the Chery Omoda 5. The controls in here feel tighter and a lot more direct, and it just responds in a manner that feels a lot more natural and a lot more of what you'd expect from a PROTON. It's all very positive indeed. Now, the key differentiator between the X50 and the Omoda 5 obviously is in terms of powertrain. So the PROTON has one less cylinder and technically about 100cc less as well, but it produces more power and it's made it to a 7-speed dual clutch automatic rather than a CVT. Now, the benefits of that is that power is a lot more immediate. This gearbox, for example, is far more responsive than what you get from the CVT in the Omoda 5, and this engine is a lot more eager to get you up to speed, no doubt thanks to the benefit in terms of torque. But once you're at speed, you will soon realize that this car's other benefits come in terms of the way it manages its weight. The body roll and body control in this car is very, very well managed, which is why you can, or have probably seen, PROTON X50s being driven like they're sports cars, even though these are sport utility vehicles. On top of that, this e-PAS steering wheel, or electrically power-assisted steering, although it's devoid of any response, or feedback rather, it does react very quickly to your inputs in a very predictable manner. Driving this car around, I feel confident enough to chuck this thing around should I so want to. But I think the big benefit with the X50, at least with this running change, a 2024 RC update, is in terms of NVH. So a lot of people have given the X50 flack for its noise ingress from the engine as well as the vibrations that you get from the 3-cylinder. Both of those things have been addressed with this car, because not only does this car not shake as much as at idle, it feels a lot smoother when you're just sitting still. But when you have your foot on the throttle, when you're trying to get this car up to speed, even on heavy throttle input, there is very little noise that gets in from the engine bay. I would like to think that Proton's added a little bit more sound deadening in order to improve the experience in here, because this is a significant improvement over the outgoing X50. On top of that, compared to the Omoda 5, I think the engine is heard a lot less frequently. And because of the response of that gearbox, it means that you don't demand as much of the engine. So overall, everything in here is very positive indeed. And I have to say that one of the things that I think they may have addressed without talking about is the sound system. Now, the audio system in the Proton X50 previously was so bad that it would, quite frankly, infuriate me every time I drive it. But in this updated model, it seems to be a little bit better. Maybe the improved processor in the IHU has done something to the way it manages the sound, but it seems to have gotten a little bit better. On top of that, something that I forgot to mention earlier is that with the running change for the X50, we now get a hugely upgraded 360-degree camera, which is so clear that in the preview drive of this car, we were given a challenge, which was to reverse this car through a little obstacle course without hitting anything, without the mirrors, without the windows, relying entirely on the 360-degree camera. I did very well, but that is largely down to the fact that these cameras are now a lot better. Now that we're out on the motorway, I can also talk about how this car feels like at speed. So that improved body control also means that this car is a lot more confident when driven at higher speeds, but that is something the X50 has always done very well, and I have a feeling that with this model, it's only just gotten a little bit better. But again, the big change with the X50 is in terms of refinement. Previously, at 80 kilometers an hour, you would hear whistling from the A-pillar. Now, while that wind noise is still there, it has now been moved a little bit further upwards. At 90 kilometers an hour, the noise has been greatly reduced, and it only starts getting irritating when you're well north of the national speed limit. On top of that, even when you floor it in this car, it still remains, the engine remains this sort of distant grumble way over there. This car is impressively refined, not just for a Proton, but within the segment. I think that this is now on par with what you get from the Honda HR-V and Toyota Corolla Cross. However, the one downside with this car, which they have addressed somewhat, is fuel economy. So this car has been averaging about 9 liters per 100 kilometers in the week or so we've had it. And while that is certainly better than the 10 to 11 that we saw before the running change, it is still on the higher side of things. The Toyota Corolla Cross Hybrid, for example, consumes a lot less. The Honda HR-V Turbo also consumes a lot less. But critically, in the Omoda 5, fuel consumption is not a concern at all. This car is relatively frugal. In the last 1,000 kilometers or so we've had this car, it's been averaging about 8 liters per 100 kilometers. And on a run without traffic, you could see figures as low as 7.2. So this is certainly the more affordable in terms of fuel consumption between the two cars. However, while wind noise in the Omoda 5 is a lot better than the X50, you don't get that whistle from the A-pillars, road roar is a little bit more pronounced in this car. I suspect that has something to do with the GT tires, which I think are of a slightly harder compound, and so they last longer, but as a result let a little bit more roar into the cabin. On top of that, I would also argue that these GT tires might not offer quite the same performance in the variety of conditions as the X50 would. Now, not that I'm about to go and test wet weather performance too extensively, because I'd rather not crash into a wall, but from what I understand, GT tires are not necessarily the best in wet weather, although admittedly this is something that you can change very easily and without too much fuss. However, the differences between the Omoda 5 and the X50 in terms of driving experience is like night and day, simply because the Chery is set up clearly more for comfort, whereas the X50 balances dynamism and comfort quite adeptly. As a result, there is a bit more body lean in this car. The car likes to pitch and yaw a little bit more as well under braking and acceleration, but it does create a cabin that is a little bit more comfortable. So for example, if you're buying your B segment SUV just to shuttle your family about and so on, then the Omoda 5 might be a better choice because passengers will be more comfortable in this, and if you're covering longer distances, you might appreciate the fact that the Omoda 5 irons out bumps a little bit better. That said, however, if you're looking for a more dynamic drive, I think the Proton has the edge over the Omoda 5, simply because this car is prone to leaning quite severely. So for example, if you were to take, say, a large motorway exit at any degree of speed, you will feel the weight of this car shift, and then you'll feel the car lean quite noticeably. This can take away some degree of confidence, particularly when you are cruising at higher speed on the motorway, where I think the X50 might be a little bit better. But I suspect that for the majority of buyers of vehicles within this segment, you'll be spending more of your time in town, in which case the softer, more compliant suspension setup that you get in the Omoda 5 might be a little bit more appealing. Lastly, it is to do with the way the powertrain responds. So as I mentioned earlier, this car uses a CVT automatic with 9 virtual ratios, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean. But in the real world, what that means is that the Omoda 5 feels a little bit of a blunter tool compared to the X50. So when you hit the throttle, the car doesn't respond quite as quickly. It's a little bit lazy. You get quite a significant rubber band effect. Now that's a term I haven't had to use in reference to CVTs for quite some time now. And on top of that, because it is a CVT, with the nature of how it works with the engine, it does mean that the engine is a little bit more pronounced, particularly on heavier throttle, because the revs will climb and then sit there, compared to how they would be able to steadily drop in an X50. That said, however, I do feel that the cars do continue to trade blows in terms of overall refinement as well as motorway manners. I just wish that this Omoda 5 had slightly better steering, because while both cars are not particularly communicative, this one is especially numb. On top of that, if you do not set this in the sport weighting, the steering wheel is also unnervingly light, which is not great when you're driving out on the motorway. So what does it all mean then? Well, if you want a car that drives more dynamically and offers more performance and perhaps a little bit more in terms of connectivity features, then you might prefer the Proton X50. But if you prefer a more comfortable, more corseting ride, as well as something that offers, critically, Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, then you may prefer the Chery Omoda 5. Now, the reason why there isn't a clear-cut, concise answer to this is because both of these cars really do trade blows in almost every area. They're similarly priced, they're similarly spec'd, they have the same level of ADAS functionality, they have broadly the same safety features as well as safety performance in terms of the ASEAN NCAP ratings, which means that choosing either of these cars would be a pretty decent choice for a young family starting out and requiring something with a little bit more space than, say, a compact B-segment saloon. Now, if you ask me, there is a little bit more in play here, simply because it really does matter on how you feel about your car. If you prefer something that is a little bit more direct, a little bit more dynamic, then it's certainly the Proton. But if you want something that is a little bit more different, a little bit bolder, then it's certainly the Omoda 5. Bottom line is, if you're buying a B-segment SUV, you not only have to test drive both of these cars, but you have to test drive them extensively, because figuring out which one is best for you really is a subjective matter, and it's not something that I can advise in great length anyway. If you'd like to learn more about the Proton X50, we have a full review, and you can check that out at the end of this video. And we also have a full review of the Omoda 5 from about a year ago that is also at the end of the video. In any case, that concludes our comparison of the 2024 Proton X50 and the 2024 Chery Omoda 5. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to be notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, and join our new WhatsApp channel. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.